Overview: Two responses to reductionism. This presentation is a survey of the roots and nature of the philosophical scientific theory of reductionism. Reductionism is deeply embedded in the worldview of classical physics. Consequently, as classical physics became ever more deeply entrenched and widespread in Western culture, so did reductionism. One of my conclusions is that reductionism is less monolithic than many generally suppose. I try to explain the variations in reductionism via two fundamentally different approaches to the purpose of scientific theory. By the late 19th century, dualism had come to be seen as incompatible with modern science. Therefore, many working scientists and philosophers of science had come to accept reductionism as the only viable framework of scientific theory. But in more recent times, reductionism has become more nuanced and has evolved into harder and softer versions, especially in relation to the study of mind and consciousness. In order to explain the emergence of these harder and softer versions of reductionism, I'm going to suggest that there is a division in scientific culture between rationalists and empiricists. The rationalist route leads to hardline fundamentalist reduction because, firstly, rationalists are not inhibited about inquiring into the inner workings of things, the hidden mechanisms under the observable surface. Secondly, because the rationalist approach entails a very thorough thinking through of the issues in pursuit of consistency of analysis. Both of these characteristics are required in order to pursue their goal of a thoroughly consistent and comprehensible understanding of the world. The empiricist route, on the other hand, leads to a softer form of reductionism because, firstly, empiricists tend to concentrate on only what can be observed. Secondly, they are concerned to generate knowledge that works in order to pursue the prominent empiricist goal of predictability. These two characteristics gave empiricists a much higher tolerance for contradiction than rationalists, who are seeking an internally consistent understanding of the world. The rationalist route led ultimately to identity theory, which is the most radical rejection of dualism. Identity theory claims that mental states simply are brain states. In other words, mental states and brain states are one and the same thing, hence the name identity theory. Identity and related theories have led us down what I believe to be a theoretical cul-de-sac of rigidly hardline determinism, in which free will is irredeemably illusory, and even humanistic concepts of meaning are to be eliminated. This is, I believe, an example of premature closure via rigid theoretical consistency. By contrast, Empiricism has led to the idea that meaningful freedom can emerge from biological evolution, even in a completely determined world. Thus, the empiricists may have been able to punch a hole through the end of the cul-de-sac, through which further theoretical and empirical advances in consciousness studies may be able to pass. Science's Cartesian legacy. Given the rise of scientific materialism and the decline of religious faith in the scientific community around the second half of the 19th century, Cartesianism was being radically challenged. Having lost faith in God and the soul, it was perhaps inevitable that scientists would end up believing in only the materialist side of Cartesianism. Within the context of their time, reductionism probably seemed like the only other reasonable choice. It required a belief in Newtonian determinism and a conception of the universe as a clockwork mechanical machine. Thus, if you let go of res cogitans, if you give up Descartes' theological myth, then the mind and spirit side of the Cartesian split become just another form of Mysterianism, just another way of accepting that there can't and never will be a meaningful explanation of mind and consciousness. It was at this point that the paradigm of classical physics became the foundation of modern science. The metaphysical assumptions of classical physics. So, what are the assumptions of this paradigm? Goswami and others have identified 5 basic principles. Before we look at these in detail, let me emphasize that these are assumptions. They are not empirically testable. They are not the products of applying the scientific method, but rather assumptions that are intended to guide its application. In addition to Newtonian physics, these assumptions are generally rooted in monotheistic creator-God theology and Descartes' ideas about res extensa, i.e., the matter side of his divided world. Okay, so here are Goswami's 5 principles of classical physics. 1. Strong objectivism. Objects are out there. The mind and consciousness have no role in creating the world we perceive. This was a systematic version of the naive realism that folk psychology applied to the everyday world. The entire world is composed simply of objects of this kind arranged in a huge variety of combinations and states, and again, entirely independent of mind and consciousness. Secondly, Newton's conceptions of materialism and causal determinism. All events are inescapably embedded in endless causal chains. This idea comprises the concept of physical closure. 3. The principle of locality, i.e., no simultaneous causal action at a distance. This can be compared, however, with quantum theory, entanglement, tunneling, etc. 4. Materialist monism. Matter is the only form of existence. There is no other substance or realm. 5. Epiphenomenalism. The idea that any substance or process which scientific materialism regards as non-physical, such as mind, consciousness, and mental causation, is simply a byproduct of the real physical processes which underlie them. Therefore, none of these non-physical phenomena can have any causal effect on the material world. William James used the metaphor of a walking man's shadow to illustrate how this position regards consciousness. It always accompanies the man's actions, but it is simply a passive consequence of them. The shadow of consciousness can have no causal effect on the man's behavior. Others have used the steam train's whistle to make the same point. The whistle is produced by the engine, but it has no effects on its functioning and performance. 2 criteria for science. Separable roots? If we see science, as I do, as having 2 not necessarily complementary objectives, one being understanding, while the other is prediction and control, then understanding can be linked with the rationalist route and prediction and control with the empiricist. The rationalist route to fundamental reduction. With their concern with inner workings and consistency, rationalists systematically applied the principles of classical physics to mind and consciousness and came up with eliminativism and identity theory. Eliminativism flatly denies folk psychology's claim that mental states A, exist as independent entities, and B, can have causal efficacy. Identity theory states that mental states, such as beliefs, emotions, and qualia, simply are brain states and have no reality or existence apart from brain states. They are one and the same thing. Fundamentalist reduction is what's left of Cartesianism when res extensa is eliminated. Descartes was a materialist and mechanist when it came to the material world. For example, he denied consciousness to all animals. When Descartes' belief in God and spirit is removed, fundamentalist materialism is all that's left. At the same time, around the end of the 19th century, there was a major failure of introspectionist psychology. The study of mind and consciousness was reduced to objectively observable behavior or predispositions to behave. In other words, behaviorism. Given this, animal experiments, such as Pavlov's, were accepted as relevant for human psychology. And indeed, experiments in which humans were treated as animals, apart from their ability to follow verbal instructions and verbally report results, came to be regarded as the only scientific way to study human psychology. Applying Fundamentalist reduction to meaning. I think that Paul Churchland's position represents one of the most fundamentally reductive points of view in this context. It can be illustrated by a quotation which I call Churchland's apple. And here it is, quote, "It assumes that our faculty of inner observation or introspection reveals things as they really are in their innermost nature. This assumption is suspect because we already know that our other forms of observation, sight, hearing, touch, and so on, do no such thing. The red surface of an apple does not look like a matrix of molecules reflecting photons at certain critical wavelengths, but that is what it is. The sound of a flute does not sound like a sinusoidal compression wave, but that is what it is. The warmth of the summer air does not feel like the mean kinetic energy of millions of tiny molecules, but that is what it is. If one's pains and hopes and beliefs do not introspectively seem like electrochemical states in a neural network, that may be only because our faculty of introspection, like our other senses, is not sufficiently penetrating to reveal such hidden details." End of quote from Paul Churchland's Matter and Consciousness, 1988. In other words, Churchland's commitment to the ultimate reality of the objective material world completely overrides and undermines the reality of phenomenal experience. In response to this, Swinburne, Hodgson, and others have commented that this position is concerned with simply explaining the causes of phenomenal experience while denying or ignoring the experience itself. A particular issue between reductionists and non-reductionists concerns meaning. Natural human language is generally regarded as comprising both syntax and semantics. Syntax is a set of rules by which symbols can legitimately be manipulated, such as grammar in natural languages. Reductionists have no problem with this, since syntax can be achieved mechanically within physical symbol systems. Semantics, however, is concerned with how particular meanings can be ascribed to particular symbols. Consequently, fundamentalist reductionists, such as Stephen Stitch, are willing to simply give up the use of the concept meaning. Brain states are simply functional states and are not concerned with subjective meaning. In this total computational model, computers are capable of intelligence, though probably not consciousness. But then, from a fundamentalist reductionist point of view, consciousness is, in any case, nothing but an epiphenomenal illusion. To criticize the computational position, John Searle devised a thought experiment, the Chinese room, which has become one of the most famous in the history of theories of consciousness. Messages in the form of sequences of Chinese ideograms are inputted on one side of the room. The operator inside the Chinese room does not speak Chinese in any conventional sense. Instead, he has an operating manual in English, which tells him which Chinese ideograms to respond with according to which ideograms come in. This enables him to put together a response in the form of a different string of Chinese ideograms, which he outputs on the other side of the room. This response is meaningful and comprehensible to the genuine Chinese speaker on the other side of the room. Stitch and many other fundamentalists regard the Chinese room as an adequate model. No need for understanding semantics or meaning. The empiricist Dennett, however, describes the Chinese room as an intuition pump, i.e., an inadequate model for the complexity of the brain. As an example of rationalist reductionists applying neuroscience findings, we can consider this. The total input capacity of the human organism for sensory information is 10 to 100 million bits per second, whereas the maximum output capacity from consciousness is only 3 to 50 bits per second. One conclusion from this is that the brain's machine language, also called mentalese, has a much broader bandwidth than natural languages. In other words, it's much faster and more efficient. One apparently serious suggestion from a reductive fundamentalist is to directly couple together the corpus callosum from one human brain to another. The corpus callosum is a very thick communication cable of neural fibers connecting the two hemispheres of the brain. The implication of this thought experiment is that communication between these two individuals would bypass not just natural language, but also consciousness, and maybe even meaning in a folk psychological sense. The empiricist route to liberal determinism. Let's now look at the empiricist route to a more nuanced version of reductionism. And let's recall that the understanding side of science is important for rationalists, while for empiricists, the prediction and control side is more important. A prominent spokesperson for the empiricists is Gilbert Ryle and his student Daniel Dennett. An example of the contrast with the rationalist is Dennett's view that it's legitimate for people to adopt what he calls the intentionalist stance to deal with the behavior of others versus the eliminative materialist insistence on abolishing folk psychology. Ryle advocated a version of philosophical behaviorism insofar as his ambition was to get rid of traditional ideas about mind and consciousness. Ryle invented the slogan, "The ghost in the machine." He also called Cartesian dualism the official doctrine. Ryle saw all talk about mental states as a category mistake. By a category mistake, Ryle meant a way of talking about something which, while it might be useful as a shortcut in certain contexts, fundamentally misunderstood the phenomenon in question. He gave the example of a foreigner asking to be shown Oxford University. When he had been shown all the colleges, research institutes, sports facilities, etc., which in reality compose this very complex institution, he inquired, "Yes, but where is the university?" thus demonstrating his lack of understanding of its real nature. In the same way, Ryle believed, treating mind and consciousness as real things was a category mistake which failed to understand their true nature. In line with the dominant linguistic tradition of British philosophy at the time, Ryle believed that analyzing and correcting the way one used language could be used as a therapy to avoid making category errors. There's a passage in Ryle which, I believe, illustrates the rationalist-empiricist dichotomy. It concerns a man accused of shooting someone. Ryle considers the sort of questions that can be asked about how and why the gun fired, both in terms of how guns work and how human beings work. Quote, "Men are not machines, they are men." People often ask such questions as, how does my mind get my hand to make the required movements? And even, what makes my hand do what my mind tells it to do? Questions of these patterns are properly asked of certain chain processes. The question, what makes the bullet fly out of the barrel, is properly answered by the expansion of gases in the cartridge. So when it is asked, how does my mind get my finger to squeeze the trigger, the form of the question presupposes that a further chain process is involved, embodying still earlier tensions, releases, and discharges, though this time mental ones. But the performance of it has to be described in just the same way as in ordinary life we describe the squeezing of the trigger by the marksman. Namely, we simply say, he did it, and not he did or underwent something else which caused it. Men are not machines. Quote, many rationalist reductionists would, I believe, flatly contradict this. To them, human beings are machines in the form of biocomputers. Ryle seems to claim that asking, how does my mind get my finger to squeeze the trigger, is an improper question. This seems to be an early invocation of Dennett's intentional stance, i.e., of treating others as responsible agents when judging their behavior. The computer model and the origins of functionalism. Functionalism is another alternative to the rationalists' reductive identity theory. This was an outgrowth of the computer model of the mind, especially the separation of software from hardware. The brain is equated with the hardware, while the mind represents the software. Functionalism was one of the foundations of the new discipline of cognitive science and is probably still the mainstream position among cognitive scientists. Quotation about functionalism from Nicholas Humphrey. The theory that mental states in general are nothing other than mathematically defined computational states has come to be known as functionalism. But while many would agree that there could be an equivalence between computational states and certain sorts of mental processes, they draw the line at conscious mental process and draw it more firmly still at conscious awareness of subjective feelings. It is certainly a strange idea that states of consciousness correspond to logical rather than material states of the brain. It seems especially strange when we realize that, if it is right, these same logical states could exist in an inanimate machine, and that the machine, whatever it was made of, would thereby have conscious feeling." End quote. Many have commented that functionalism is in fact a new form of dualism, though this time, on the other side of the split, opposite matter is not a spiritual realm of mind and consciousness, but the abstract world of maths and logic. This ultimately abstract world is, after all, also outside of space and time. This new split in functionalism invokes the concept of supervenience as a bridge between the two worlds, rather than the interaction of Cartesianism. A simple way to characterize supervenience is to say that mental states are dependent on brain states, but not determined by them. Chalmers invokes a fourfold division of supervenience. Firstly, a natural/logical distinction, and second, a local/global distinction. In Chalmers' complex interpretation, global supervenience is context dependent, whereas local supervenience isn't. Briefly, all this reverts to Hume's point that causation is more than correlation and is not simple and obvious. This is one of the core messages of functionalism. This more nuanced view of causation leads empiricists to a softer form of determinism, characterized by compatibilism, i.e., the idea that determinism is compatible with behavioral choice. David Deutsch provides a metaphor to illustrate the difference in metaphysical assumptions between the empiricists and the rationalist reductionists. If we see science as a skyscraper, then physics is the foundation of the whole edifice. Chemistry is located slightly higher up. And finally, social sciences like economics and sociology are located at the very top. A big issue is whether everything in these higher areas of study is reducible to physics, as rationalist reductionism would claim, or whether there can be multi-level causality, as empiricists would accept. And the really big issue is whether there can be top-down causation. In other words, whether, for example, sociological or economic forces can independently produce chemical or physical effects. Dennett's freedom via perspective. It may be, I believe, that the milder of these positions lies behind Dennett's slogan that determinism does not mean inevitability. But Dennett does not mean Descartes' absolute freedom of thought. Rather, the possibility of freedom can be seen as arising from competition between various causal chains within the human organism. This provides a real basis for behavioral flexibility, which we experience as freedom of choice. Fundamentalist determinism attempts to conceptualize the world from a God's eye perspective. This is part of the Rationalist program. Dennett contrasts this with what I call his empiricist position of the intentional stance, in which it is accepted that people will believe that both they and a wide variety of other entities are engaged agents responsible for their intentions and behavior. From this perspective, it seems to us that we have real choices and can exercise freedom, even though everything that happens has material causes. Thus, while both rationalists and empiricists accept the reductionism of classical physics, empiricists are able to combine this with a belief in naturalistic free will, while rationalists are not. The difference, I believe, arises from emphasizing one side of science over the other, i.e., prediction over understanding.